Have you ever reeled in your jig, found a clump of grass on the hook, and thought absolutely nothing of it? What if I told you that clump of grass was actually the 10-pound pre-spawn bass you have been hunting for your entire life? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving deep into the most frustrating and misunderstood part of early spring fishing. We are talking about the subtle, ghost-like bites that 99% of fishermen completely ignore. I promise you, by the end of this video, you are going to realize just how many massive fish you have accidentally ripped your bait away from. We are going to uncover the absolute truth about why the biggest bass in the lake do not bite the way your grandfather taught you they would. Tell me the truth in the comments right now. How many times have you set the hook on a snag, only to feel a giant fish shake its head and immediately pop off? Let us fix that exact problem today. Every single spring, fishermen all over the country make the exact same pilgrimage to their local lakes. The ice melts, the weather warms up just a little bit, and we all grab our heavy rods and big jigs. We are chasing that legendary pre-spawn monster. This is the time of year when the heaviest fish are caught, so the stakes are incredibly high. But here is the massive problem. Most of us are stuck in our old habits. We fish the exact same way we do in July. We carry this stubborn belief that a big fish is going to hit our lure like a freight train. We have been taught for generations that when a bass bites, you will absolutely feel the violent thump in your hands. But that old school thinking is exactly why so many guys go home empty-handed in March and April. We keep doing the exact same things, dragging baits too fast, waiting for a massive strike, and blaming the cold water when we do not catch anything. The truth is the fish are biting. You just do not know how to listen to them yet. Picture this. It is a freezing cold Saturday morning in early spring. You are sitting on the boat or standing on the bank, shivering in your heavy jacket. The mist is slowly rolling off the surface of the lake. This is your very first fishing trip of the season, and you have been dreaming about this moment for months. You finally tie on your favorite jig, the one that caught you so many fish last summer, and you make that glorious first cast. The lure hits the water, sinks to the bottom, and you start your slow drag. Suddenly, your rod tip feels a little heavy. There is a very soft, almost unnoticeable bump. It feels exactly like your jig just dragged through a clump of dead winter weeds. You do what any normal person would do. You give the rod a hard rip to clear the grass off your hook. But the moment you rip it, the water swirls, and you see the massive flash of a 10-pound pre-spawn bass swimming away. You just ripped your bait right out of her mouth because you thought she was a weed. This happens to thousands of guys every single spring. Why do we ignore these subtle taps? Because our brains are wired to expect violent strikes. We want the Hollywood movie version of a bite. But in early spring, the reality is completely different. If you do not change your mindset right now, you are going to spend the next 2 months ripping baits away from the biggest bass in your lake. Let us talk about the actual biology of these fish right now. In the early spring, the water temperature is barely hovering around 45 or maybe 50 degrees. The bass are just waking up from their winter lethargy. Their metabolism is incredibly slow. They are not chasing fast-moving bait fish across shallow flats like they do in the middle of summer. Instead, they are moving slowly, conserving every single drop of energy they have. When a big female bass sees your jig crawling along the bottom, she does not rush over and smash it aggressively. She simply glides over to it, opens her massive mouth, and gently flares her gills. That action creates a sudden underwater vacuum. The jig just slides into her mouth. She does not turn her head. She does not swim away. She just sits there, barely moving. Because she did not swim away, your rod tip does not bend. There is no violent strike. There is no thump. There is just a tiny, almost microscopic loss of tension, or a very subtle, heavy feeling. If you are expecting a summertime bite, you are going to completely miss this biological reality. You will keep dragging that jig right past the biggest fish in the lake, thinking your lure is just picking up dead leaves or sliding over muddy grass. You have to understand that right now, in this cold water, the fish are feeding in slow motion. Think about the mechanics of how you actually feel a bite on the end of your fishing line. When a fish hits a crankbait, the fish is swimming one way and you are reeling the other way. That opposing force travels up the line, down the rod, and hits your hand like a lightning bolt. But with a jig in the early pre-spawn, there is absolutely zero opposing force. You cast out, the bait hits the bottom, and you are slowly dragging it back. The base inhales it from behind or from the side and just stops. It is like someone walked up behind you and gently grabbed your coat. You do not feel a shock wave. You just feel a sudden strange weight. This is exactly what we call the vacuum bite. It is the most misunderstood bite in all of bass fishing. When that vacuum happens, the bait simply disappears into the mouth of the fish. If there is any slack in your line at all, you will not feel a single thing in your hands. The only clue you get is that your bait suddenly feels just a little bit mushy, exactly like dragging it through a patch of soft weeds. Your immediate reaction is usually frustration. You think you ruined the cast by getting snagged. So you give the rod a sharp snap to rip the bait free. By doing that, you literally pull the hook right past the lips of a 10-pound giant before she even has a chance to bite down. We really need to talk about the grandfather myth. You have probably heard it a million times from older guys at the bait shop. They always say, if a good fish bites your bait, you will definitely know it. That is complete nonsense when it comes to early spring bass. In fact, it is the exact opposite of reality. In the middle of summer, sure, a 2-pound fish will try to rip the rod right out of your hands. But in water that is 45 degrees, the bigger the fish, the softer the bite. A massive female bass does not need to aggressively attack her prey. She is the apex predator in that lake. She simply swims up behind your bait and lazily sucks it in. The older and bigger the fish is, the less energy she wants to waste. So, you are out there waiting for a massive thump that is never going to happen. You are totally ignoring those tiny microscopic ticks on your line because you have been trained to think that a big fish makes a big impact. It is time to completely throw that old myth in the garbage. If you keep waiting for the thump, you are going to miss every single trophy fish this spring. It is time to realize that the monsters bite like ghosts. If you want to stop missing these early spring giants, you have to become a dedicated line watcher. If you are only relying on your hands to feel the bite, you are fishing completely blind. When the water is freezing cold, bass often pick up the bait and swim slightly toward you. When they do that, there is absolutely zero tension on your rod tip. You will not feel a single thing in your hands, but your eyes will tell you exactly what is happening. You might see the line suddenly jump just a tiny bit on the surface of the water. You might see your line slowly start swimming to the left or to the right, or most commonly, your line will just go completely slack before it is supposed to hit the bottom. That is the fish. That is the trophy you have been looking for. You have to train your eyes to stare at the spot where your line enters the water like a hawk. Every time you cast, watch how the line behaves. If it does anything weird, anything at all, you have to react. Your hands will lie to you in the spring, but your line will always tell you the truth. If you look away to talk to your buddy, you just missed your only bite of the day. Let us describe exactly what that bite actually feels like when you do manage to feel it. It does not feel like a sharp tap. It does not feel like an electric shock. It feels exactly like you just dragged your lure into a heavy, wet sock. Imagine you are slowly dragging your jig across a clean, hard bottom. You can feel the rocks tapping against the lure. Tap, tap, tap. Then, suddenly, the tapping completely stops, and the rod just feels mushy and heavy. Most guys assume they just hit a patch of mud or a clump of dead winter grass. They drop their rod tip, give it a quick pop to clear the grass, and completely miss the fish. When a bass flares its gills and inhales that jig in slow motion, it just adds dead weight to your line. The fish is holding the bait in its mouth, but it is not swimming away. It is just sitting there. That heavy, mushy, wet sock feeling is the holy grail of early spring fishing. You have to reprogram your brain to stop getting annoyed by that mushy feeling. Instead of thinking you are snagged on weeds, you need to start assuming that every single wet sock feeling is a new personal best base. The absolute worst enemy you have on the water right now is your own hesitation. Picture this scenario. You make a long cast out to a rocky point. You let the bait sink. You start your slow drag. Suddenly, you get that weird, mushy feeling we just talked about. What is the very first thing that pops into your head? You ask yourself, is that a fish or is that a rock? You pause. You gently lift the rod tip to try and feel if there is a heartbeat on the other end. You wait for the fish to pull back. That hesitation right there is exactly why you lose the fish. When you gently pull back to check if it is a fish, the base immediately feels the unnatural tension of your rod. The fish realizes that the crawfish it just ate is actually a piece of metal and plastic. In a fraction of a second, the base opens its mouth and spits your bait out. By the time you finally decide to set the hook, you are swinging at empty water. You cannot ask yourself questions. You cannot investigate the bite. If it feels weird, you swing. Hesitation will ruin your entire fishing trip. You have to burn this phrase into your memory forever. Hook sets are absolutely free. It does not cost you a single dime to swing your rod. So many fishermen are terrified of looking silly. They do not want their buddy in the back of the boat to laugh at them for setting the hook on a tree stump. They do not want to pull their bait out of the strike zone for no reason. So they wait. They wait until they are 100% sure it is a fish. And because they wait, they catch nothing. Let me tell you a secret. The best professional fishermen in the world set the hook on rocks, weeds, and tree stumps all day long. They look like complete fools sometimes, but they also catch the biggest fish in the lake. If your lure feels a little bit heavy, swing as hard as you can. If your line ticks slightly to the right, swing. If you suddenly lose contact with your jig, swing. The absolute worst thing that happens is you look a little silly and you have to reel in and cast again. The best thing that happens is you drag a 10-pound monster into the boat. Stop worrying about looking stupid and start setting the hook on every single weird feeling. We cannot talk about early spring fishing without talking about the wind. Springtime is notoriously windy. You will often find yourself fishing in 10 or 15 mile-per-hour gusts. The wind is a huge factor because it puts a massive bow in your fishing line. When there is a big curve of slack line blowing in the wind between your rod tip and the water, it becomes almost impossible to detect a subtle bite. The wind completely absorbs that tiny little tick of a pre-spawn base inhaling your jig. You could have a giant fish chewing on your bait for 5 solid seconds, and you would never feel a single vibration through that slack line. To fix this, you have to keep your rod tip pointed slightly down toward the water. You need to keep as much line out of the wind as physically possible. If you hold your rod high in the air, the wind is going to play your line like a guitar string, and you will miss every single subtle bite. You also need to watch that bow in the line carefully. If the wind is blowing your line to the left, but suddenly your line stops moving or twitches to the right, you need to set the hook immediately. Your fishing equipment plays a massive role in whether you catch these fish or just drag baits past them. A lot of guys are out there using 20-year-old fiberglass rods or heavy, cheap composite rods. They think a rod is just a stick to pull fish out of the water. But in the early spring, your rod is a communication device. It is an antenna. If you are using a dead heavy rod, you are completely blind underwater. You will never feel the difference between a rock, a piece of wood, and a subtle bass bite. You need a highly sensitive, lightweight carbon graphite rod. A good stiff rod blank transmits every single vibration straight into your hand. When your jig drags over a piece of wood, a sensitive rod will make it feel scratchy and rough. When your jig taps a rock, it will feel like a sharp, hard ping. And when a bass gently sucks the bait in, you will instantly feel that dead, mushy weight. Upgrading your rod is not just about showing off fancy gear. It is about buying the ability to see underwater. If you want to feel those microscopic pre-spawn taps, you have to invest in a rod that can actually transmit them to your hands. Let us dive into the great debate about fishing line. A lot of fishermen love using straight braided line because it has zero stretch and it is incredibly strong. But in the cold water of early spring, straight braid can actually be your worst enemy. Braid floats, and it catches the wind very easily. But more importantly, braid is incredibly visible in clear spring water, and it has absolutely zero slackline sensitivity. If there is even 1 inch of slack in a braided line, you will not feel the bite. This is why you must use fluorocarbon line, or at least a very long fluorocarbon leader. Fluorocarbon sinks. It cuts through the wind much better than braid. Most importantly, fluorocarbon transmits vibration even when the line is slightly slack. This is a massive advantage when you are pausing your jig on the bottom. When that bass casually inhales the bait on a slack line, the fluorocarbon will still transmit a faint little tick up to your rod tip. Plus, it is completely invisible underwater, which is crucial because cold water bass have plenty of time to stare at your bait before they decide to eat it. Switch to fluorocarbon and watch your catch rate skyrocket. Let us talk about jig weight, because this is where 90% of guys make a huge mistake. They go to the tackle shop and buy big, heavy half-ounce or 3/4-ounce jigs. They think a heavier jig will cast further and stay on the bottom better. But in the early spring, a heavy jig is terrible. When you drag a massive piece of lead across a soft spring bottom, it digs into the mud. It buries itself under dead leaves and winter slime. It looks completely unnatural. And worse, when a sluggish cold water bass tries to suck it in, that heavy chunk of lead is just too heavy to fly into their mouth easily. You need to drastically downsize your weight. Switch to a 1/4-ounce or a 3/8-ounce jig. A lighter jig glides over the rocks instead of crashing into them. It rests gently on top of the mud instead of sinking into it. And most importantly, when that giant female bass simply flares her gills, a light jig gets sucked effortlessly deep into the roof of her mouth. The bite feels much more natural to the fish, and they will hold on to it just a little bit longer, giving you the extra second you need to set the hook. Your choice of trailer on the back of that jig is just as critical. In the middle of summer, everyone loves a plastic crawfish with big flapping claws that kick violently in the water. They want maximum vibration and maximum action. But remember what we talked about regarding the biology of the lake right now. Everything underwater is moving in slow motion. If you throw a bait with violently kicking claws into 45-degree water, it looks completely unnatural. It scares the fish instead of triggering them. You need to use a trailer with zero action. We call them do-nothing trailers. Look for baits like small chunks or slender plastics that do not have flapping appendages. When you drag this through the water, it just slowly glides along, exactly like a freezing cold, sluggish crawfish. Because there are no big claws catching water resistance, the base can inhale the entire package much easier. The less your bait does right now, the more bites you're going to get. It is a very hard mental block for fishermen to overcome. We want our baits to look super lively. But in early spring, a boring, lifeless piece of plastic is exactly what the biggest fish in the lake are looking for. The single most powerful technique you can use right now is the power of the pause. Everyone fishes way too fast. You make a cast, you let it sink, and you immediately start dragging and hopping the bait back to the boat. You are in a rush to cover water. But these pre-spawn bass are not going to chase down your bait. If you drag your jig past a big female, she might just lazily follow it for 10 feet, staring at it, waiting for an opportunity. The only way you get her to bite is by completely stopping. You drag the jig a few feet, and then you just let it sit there. Do not move your rod. Do not turn the handle of your reel. Let it sit completely motionless on the bottom for 10 full seconds. I know 10 seconds feels like an absolute eternity when you are freezing on a boat, but that pause is pure magic. When the bait stops moving, the bass swims right up to it. She stares at it. And the second you barely twitch the rod to start moving it again, she inhales it. That tiny twitch after a long pause is exactly when that subtle tap happens. Slow down, stop moving, and let the fish catch up to your bait. You must learn how to visualize the bottom of the lake. Every time your lure bumps into something, you should be painting a picture in your mind. When you drag your jig over a sunken tree branch, it feels very specific. It feels like your bait is slowly climbing up a ramp, and then it suddenly snaps off the other side. When you drag it through rocks, it bounces and clacks. You need to memorize these feelings so perfectly that you instantly know when something feels wrong. The subtle tap of a pre-spawn bass is an interruption in that pattern. If you are bouncing through rocks, ping, 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 and suddenly you feel nothing but a heavy sponge, that is the interruption. That is the bite. The only way to get good at recognizing the interruption is to pay intense attention to the normal stuff. Most guys just blindly reel in, daydreaming about lunch or looking at their phones. If you are not actively focusing on what the bottom of the lake feels like on every single cast, you will never notice when a 10-pound bass quietly interrupts your rhythm. Fishing a jig in cold water is a game of absolute mental focus. Let us talk about what happens when a bass spits your bait out, because it happens way faster than you think. A bass has an incredibly sensitive mouth. They can tell the difference between a real, soft crawfish and a hard metal hook in a fraction of a second. When you feel that subtle tap and you freeze up, the bass is already starting the rejection process. She crushes the jig in her crushes, feels the hard lead head, and immediately opens her mouth to blow it out. You literally have about 1 second to react. If you wait for the fish to swim away so you can feel a steady pull on the rod, you are already too late. By the time the rod tip bends, the bass has already spit the bait out and is swimming away empty-handed. That is why you feel that quick bump and then nothing. You reel in, check your bait, and find your plastic trailer pulled halfway down the hook. You stand there scratching your head, wondering what happened. What happened was a giant fish gave you exactly 1 second to make a decision, and you decided to think about it instead of setting the hook. Speed of reaction is your best weapon against the spit. You also need to understand how the weather throughout the day affects this subtle bite. A lot of guys think that because the sun comes out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and warms the surface water, the fish are going to magically become super aggressive. They think the subtle bite turns into a massive strike, but that is largely a myth. Yes, the shallow water warms up a few degrees and some fish might move up to the sunny banks. But those giant female pre-spawn bass, the really big ones, they are still holding deep on staging drops and points. The water down there at 15 feet deep does not change temperature just because the sun came out for an hour. Those big girls are still going to feed in exact slow motion. They are still going to give you that tiny, mushy ghost bite. So do not let a nice sunny afternoon trick you into fishing faster and expecting violent strikes. Maintain your discipline. Keep fishing slow. Keep watching your line and keep expecting the bite to be as soft as a whisper. The environment deep underwater takes weeks to warm up, not hours. Stay patient and stick to the slow game plan. We really need to have a serious ego check right now. This is a harsh reality that a lot of veteran fishermen refuse to accept. Beginners actually catch a lot of early spring bass precisely because they do not know what they are doing. A beginner will cast out, let the bait sit in one spot for way too long because they are untangling a backlash, and then they will accidentally set the hook because they think they are snagged. They blindly stumble into doing the exact right things. Meanwhile, the guy who has been fishing for 30 years is too proud to admit he is doing it wrong. He power fishes down the bank, dragging his jig way too fast, refusing to set the hook unless he feels a thump, because he thinks he knows better. He goes home skunked and blames the cold front. If you want to have the best spring season of your life, you have to leave your ego at the boat ramp. You have to admit that the old school ways of power fishing do not work when the water is freezing. You have to be humble enough to slow down, look foolish, setting the hook on a few rocks, and fish like you are learning everything for the very first time. Try visualizing exactly what is happening under the water on your very next cast. Imagine your bait sinking down into the dark, freezing water. It lands softly on a patch of gravel. You let it sit for 10 seconds. From the shadows, a massive shadow slowly glides forward. She stops just inches from your lure. Her fins are barely moving. You gently drag the jig 2 inches. She tilts her head down, flares her gills, and a sudden rush of water pulls the jig right off the bottom and into her mouth. She closes her jaws and just hovers there, perfectly suspended. Up on the surface, you are holding the rod. You feel a tiny, strange loss of tension. You do not ask questions. You do not wait for a thump. You instantly drop the rod tip, reel up the slack line, and swing with everything you have. The rod loads up into a massive arc. You feel the heavy, thumping head shakes of a true pre-spawn giant. The drag screams, and you finally realize that every single word we just talked about is absolutely true. That mental movie is what you need to play in your head every single time you cast. It keeps you focused, and it keeps you ready for that microscopic tap. So, what is the ultimate rule for your next fishing trip? It is very simple. From the moment you make your first cast in cold spring water, every single abnormality on the end of your line is a 10-pound bass until proven otherwise. Every single piece of mushy grass, every single heavy, wet sock feeling, every time your line ticks a 1/4 of an inch to the left, every time your bait feels weightless for half a second, you treat every single one of those moments as if the biggest fish of your entire life just ate your lure. You swing hard and you swing fast. Yes, you are going to catch a few tree branches. Yes, you are going to reel in some dead leaves. But you are also going to stop ripping your jig out of the mouths of trophy bass. You are going to start connecting with fish that you used to completely ignore. This is the secret that separates the guys who catch giants in March from the guys who just complain about the cold weather. It is not about having a magical lure. It is about understanding the subtle nature of the pre-spawn bite and having the absolute confidence to pull the trigger when your instincts tell you something feels slightly off. We have covered exactly why that subtle tap was not a weed and why ignoring it has cost you some of the biggest fish of your life. The biggest turning point for any angler is realizing that a giant bass does not need to hit a lure like a freight train. When you finally accept that the biggest pre-spawn bass feed with a gentle ghost-like vacuum, your entire approach to spring fishing transforms. You stop waiting for the violent thump and start hunting for that heavy, mushy, wet sock feeling. That single shift in your mindset is exactly what turns a frustrating day on cold water into a day where you catch your new personal best. Thank you so much for watching and for hanging out with me today. If you learned something new, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video to help the channel grow. Now, I have a question for you to answer in the comments. What is the most ridiculous thing you have ever set the hook on thinking it was a massive bass? Let us hear your best stories down below, and I will see you on the water next time.